Yeah.
In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Before I call on questions, I'd like to inform the House that seated in the Distinguished Visitors Gallery today is His Excellency General Teo Matan Roak, the Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste, accompanied by the Foreign Minister Adelgisa Magno and Her Excellency Inez Almeida, also of the Ambassador for the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste. A very warm welcome to you all. And I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and it is indeed my pleasure to also welcome Prime Minister Teo Matan Roak to the Australian Parliament. And I thank the Prime Minister for his personal support for the important partnership between Australia and Timor-Leste. Timor-Leste and Australia are more than just near neighbours. We share a strong and a vibrant friendship. This relationship was forged, of course, during World War II, when the people of Timor-Leste saved many Australian lives, and at great cost to themselves. One of those lives that they saved was my mentor, Tommy Wren, who was, of course, captured on Timor along with other members of Sparrow Force and other forces that were there during World War II. The Timorese literally put their lives on the line to save Australian lives. And I know that at the memorial that's there in Marrickville Park in my electorate, there's a tribute to the courage of the Timorese. Our friendship has grown even stronger in the decades since, particularly since independence. In 2019, I was very honoured to visit Dili with the then Prime Minister Morrison, for the 20th anniversary of the independence referendum. It took enormous sacrifices for Timor-Leste to achieve its sovereignty, and I want to acknowledge that today, as well as the efforts by leaders since then to make democracy work. Today, with this visit, the Prime Minister and I reaffirm the bond between our nations and our commitment to deepening it further. We've discussed defence and economic cooperation, labour mobility, and our joint commitment to security and prosperity of the region. And we know that important projects, including the Greater Sunrise Project that we discussed today, I discussed it with Woodside last week when I was in Perth, important for the future development of Timor-Leste. I am incredibly optimistic about our future. Timor-Leste has a lot of friends in Australia, and everyone in this chamber can be counted upon as part of that. So again, I thank you, Prime Minister, for bringing your delegation here today. You are very, very welcome.
And I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, to Prime Minister, Your Excellency Teo Matan Roak, thank you very much for being here today, as well as your Minister for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, Her Excellency Adelgisa Magno, and the Ambassador. To the three of you, most welcome guests, and on behalf of the Coalition, it's a great honour to have you in the chamber with us today. In his memoir, the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove reflected on his time commanding the multinational peacekeeping forces in East Timor. He spoke of the stoicism, of the cohesion and the energy of your national community, of the hardy nature of your people, of the generosity of spirit that exists in the hearts of East Timorese. Our two countries' relationship is characterised by a deep and abiding friendship, a friendship forged by our interlocked histories, our shared neighbourhood in and peaceful outlook for the region, and the mutual respect which exists between our people. Prime Minister Roak, in 2007, Australian Prime Minister John Howard wrote about the difficult and demanding task which faced your people in building a sustainable, democratic and prosperous future. It is something you know more than most. As a former freedom fighter, Chief of the Defence Force, Human Rights Award recipient and President of your country, 16 years on from Prime Minister Howard's remarks, Australians look on with admiration at what East Timorese have accomplished. Our two countries today are dear friends and we share a very strong future as friends and as partners.
Questions without notice, and I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister please update the House on the earthquake in Turkey and Syria and what the Australian Government is doing in response?
Call the Prime Minister.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question and for his support for the government action up to this point, and I welcome the Turkish Ambassador, His Excellency Ufuk Gazar, here in the gallery this afternoon. On behalf of the Government, the Parliament and the people of Australia, I extend my deepest condolences to all those affected by the devastating earthquakes and aftershocks in Turkey, in Syria and neighbouring countries. Our hearts are heavy. It is impossible to look away from the terrible and heartbreaking scenes of loss. There's a terrible scale of the devastation, whole blocks levelled and buried. But the real devastation, of course, is for people. There are the small images of unimaginable pain, a parent searching desperately for a child, a newborn girl rescued from the rubble whose mother will never hold her in her arms. This is a disaster that at first seems so vast as to almost be beyond comprehension, but every tragedy is happening on a very human scale. Every loss, every moment of grief, fear and desperation. We know that at least 4,500 lives have been lost. We know those figures will continue to rise. Many more than that have been injured. So many Australians have families in Turkey and Syria and the region, and I can only imagine the depth of their anxiety as they await news. Our immediate priority is the safety of Australian citizens and permanent residents affected by the earthquakes. Our embassies in Ankara, Istanbul and Beirut are assisting Australians in these areas. I'm pleased to confirm that Australia will deploy an urban search and rescue team of up to 72 personnel to Turkey to assist local authorities. These urban search and rescue specialists are highly trained to locate, deliver medical assistance to and remove victims who have been trapped or impacted by a structural collapse. Our National Emergency Management Agency, or NEMA, is working closely with Fire and Rescue New South Wales, DFAT and the ADF to coordinate the deployment as soon as possible with an aim to have people on the ground by the end of this week. I want to thank the personnel and their families in advance once again. They're willing to support people wherever support is needed. And I'm sure I speak for all Australians when I wish them all a safe journey. We're also providing an initial $10 million in humanitarian assistance to trusted partners in the region, and I thank the Parliament for its bipartisan support for that commitment. This will support the delivery of food, shelter and other essential supplies. I know many Australians will want to help too. The most effective way is to donate to one of the Australian non-government organisations such as the Red Cross, who are appealing for support.
And I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. On indulgence, I want to say thank you very much to the Prime Minister, to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Minister for Defence and others within the National Security Committee of Cabinet who would have contemplated these images and taken the advice from our authorities. Australians can see in their government and in their opposition an absolute bipartisan position in providing support where it's needed to friends in their hour of need. It's been the history of our country, a very proud history where we've been able to step up through the systems and the training and the expertise that we've developed over a long period of time to lend a helpful hand to people in efforts to recover from devastation. We especially think at the moment of Australians who may have been caught up in this disaster, and of course, as the Prime Minister points out, families of Australians and friends of Australians who have been affected. Thousands have been killed. The Prime Minister mentioned a figure before. I read online earlier, perhaps more than 7,000 people. We just don't know. But an unimaginable number of people, their homes and essential infrastructure in ruins, ancient historical sites have been damaged or destroyed. And as is the case with such disasters, only coming days and weeks and months will a clearer picture emerge of the number of people who have lost their lives. I saw a very confronting image online earlier of a man who was holding the hand of his 15-year-old daughter, still laying in her bed but crushed by a slab of concrete. Hesmet Hansa was his name, and his 15-year-old daughter, Ermak. She lay there deceased, he not flinching nor prepared to leave the scene until she could be recovered. Another confronting scene of a man standing up against a wall of rubble, within his hands simply a sledgehammer, a task that would take an excavator weeks or machinery weeks to deal with, and yet he wanted to do what he could by his family. And those scenes and those names, whilst they're at far distance from our shores, should not be forgotten and should not drift from our minds. If there is more that the Australian Government is called upon to do and sees fit to do, then the Coalition will provide that support, Prime Minister. And the pace at which the Government's responded is to be acknowledged and recognised. And when you talk about an earthquake of this magnitude of 7.8 and the circumstances that we've outlined, it is phenomenal. And we have an obligation to support our friends around the world, and the work that DFAT does in keeping Australians here informed of their loved ones overseas shouldn't be underestimated at a time when there's great anxiety for many, many Australians, and we stand united with the Government in providing that support.
And I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Now, changing pace slightly, I'm sorry. My question is to the Prime Minister. Before the election, this Prime Minister promised that families will be better off under a Labor government. Yet there is no relief in sight, and under Labor, families are worse off day by day. There have been 8 successive rate rises under this Prime Minister. Mortgage repayments have increased by $1,400 for a typical Australian family since Labor was elected, and the Prime Minister has not outlined a plan to deal with rising inflation. I ask the Prime Minister, when will he prioritise Australian families and small businesses and help them with the cost of living crisis they are facing?
I call the Prime Minister.
Well, we prioritise supporting families and small business every day. Those opposite come in here and vote against relief for families and small business every day. And last December, they came in here and voted against a $1.5 billion package. They voted against it. They raise inflation. Well, here's what the bloke opposite had to say. Nobody wants to see interest rates go up, but it's a reality of a world where there's inflation. I think Australians understand that.
Member for Moncrieff.
There's a lot of pressure, upward pressure, on interest rates at the moment. That's what he had to say as a minister in the Morrison government. As a minister in the Morrison government when interest rates started going up. And the Shadow Treasurer,
Member for Hume and Barker will cease ejecting.
The Shadow Treasurer barks across the chamber, but he had to say, at the same time, we're facing circumstances in what's happening in the Ukraine and Russia that were not expected and very hard to predict. These pressures are driven by extenuating circumstances. Mr. Speaker, their hypocrisy knows no bounds. Their hypocrisy knows no bounds. They come in here, and they have no actually constructive plans to put forward. They come in here and they vote against our energy price relief plan.
Leader of the Nationals
they vote
will cease
against free
ejecting.
TAFE. They voted against electric vehicle discount. They vote against wages going up. They went up there, the people who speak about people under pressure, when we went up, remember during the election campaign, the idea of a $1 an hour increase was going to wreck the economy. It was reckless. It was irresponsible. Those opposite say no to price caps from big energy companies. They say no to price caps. They say no to $1.5 billion in direct price relief, bill relief. And of course, they won't ever take serious action when it comes to dealing with these issues. But I just say to them, if you just get out of the way when people do have positive suggestions and plans, such as we are already implementing to address the cost of living pressures which are out there.
Order. There's far too much noise on my left and right. When the House comes to order and there is complete silence, give the call to the member for Macon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. How has the Albanese Labor government changed previous practices in order to prioritise delivering key procurements and projects with local industry to guarantee Australia's national security?
I call the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for his question and acknowledge his advocacy for South Australian defence industry. In December of 2013, Treasurer Joe Hockey stood at this very dispatch box and said to the Australian car industry, either you're here or you're not. And with that, they left. Thousands of jobs gone. Capability lost. This was the highest tech, most complex manufacturing that we did in Australia, and the fundamentalist economic policies of those opposite laid waste to the jewel of Australian manufacturing. And for all the hoopla that we've seen afterwards, the honest truth is that their attitude to industry policy was reflected in their attitude to defence industry. Almost their first decision was to see Australia's supply ship be built in Spain, and thus they exposed the workforce at the Osborne shipyard in Adelaide to a valley of death. They wanted to have our next generation of submarines built in Japan, and so began 10 years of dithering around our submarine capability. On with the Japanese, off with the Japanese, on with the French, off with the French, so that after almost 10 years in office we saw no submarine steel cut in Adelaide under this government, and they exposed the country to a dangerous capability gap with our submarines, which we have been left to fix. Big on announcement, short on delivery. The truth of defence industry over there was 28 different programs running a combined 97 years over time. And they never understood the strategic rationale for defence industry, the way in which it can build Australia's strategic weight, how we can be taken more seriously around the world. When Austal, an Australian shipbuilder building 12% of the American surface fleet, ships being designed in Fremantle, were bidding for the next generation of Australian frigates, those opposite did absolutely nothing. Indeed, the number of former ministers who visited Austal's shipyard in Mobile, Alabama during that period of time was precisely zero. Well, this government is very different. In the very near future, we will be announcing the optimal pathway to build Australia's nuclear-powered submarines, and at the heart of that will be developing the capacity as soon as possible to see nuclear-powered submarines built in Adelaide. High-tech, high-skilled, transformative industry, because we are a government which is committed to seeing Australia being a country which makes things. We are a government which is committed to seeing our key defence assets being built in this country to drive Australian industry and to keep Australians safe.
Before I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, there is far too much noise in the chamber, from both sides of the chamber. This cannot continue, and if it does, I'll take action. I can't be clearer than that. I give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his promise to always fess up and correct the record when he gets it wrong. Last year, the RBA Governor apologised to any Australian affected by his advice that interest rates would stay low. Prior to the election, the Prime Minister went even further than Governor Lowe, and actually promised cheaper mortgages. Why has the Prime Minister failed to offer the same apology? Why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister will be heard in silence. I give him the call.
Thanks for the question. Well, I'm going to. The member for Cook has had a bit to say in their party room, so I'm going to add to his public statements now with what he said about shared equity schemes and what it would do, which is the question that I'm asked about. What the member for Cook said was this. We suggested that the government take out of that $8 billion they have put aside.
Prime Minister will pause for a moment. I cannot hear a word the Prime Minister is saying. The member for Page is warned. The Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. I call the Prime Minister and I want to hear what the Prime Minister is saying.
Mr. Speaker, I'm asked about shared equity schemes, and I'm quoting the member for Cook. I'm quoting the member for Cook because shared equity mortgages are a really great opportunity. That's what they had to say. And you know what he said? Why he said it was a great opportunity? He said this, and that you can reduce your payments. That's what he had to say about shared equity. We need some more options for people to stay in their homes and shared equity.
Prime Minister will pause a moment. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On a point of order and relevance, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister promised to reduce interest rates.
Resume your seat. That is not a point of order. Resume your seat. The Prime Minister was asked a question about election commitments regarding mortgages and the prices and about the costs imposed with interest rates. The Prime Minister is in order. He's answering the question about his election commitments, and I give him the call.
And the Deputy Leader of the Opposition has asked a question about our election campaign launch, which is about our shared equity scheme, our Help to Buy scheme, launched in Perth. You remember Perth? You remember Perth? I'll give you a reminder. Swan, Pearce, Stanley, Hasler.
Order.
You remember Perth?
The Prime Minister will return to the question. The Prime Minister will return to the question.
Perth?
The Prime Minister will return to the question.
When we announced the shared equity scheme, we did so because in WA it has existed for some time. In Victoria there's now a scheme, and of course the Liberal government in New South Wales has announced a scheme as well. But I'm also asked about the context of helping out cost of living.
Members on my left.
Those opposite and the Leader of the Opposition had an idea when he was the Minister about cost of living. The first chance he got, he wanted to raise the cost of seeing a GP by $7. His other big idea was to raise the cost of prescriptions by $5. We've gone down by $12.50, they went up by $5. But of course there's a link between primary health care and emergency departments, so let's not think that this wasn't a comprehensive plan, because he also wanted to, here's his idea, the government will remove the restrictions on state and territory governments that prevent hospital emergency departments charging a fee for presentation. He wanted to charge people for fronting up to emergency departments. He wanted to charge people for going to the GP, and he wanted to lift the price of medicines. That was his plan on cost of living.
Has concluded. When the House comes to order, the member for Longman is warned. Give the call to the member for Spence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry and Science. Manufacturers in my electorate have created secure, high-skill, high-wage jobs for decades and play an important role in underpinning the prosperity in Spence. What is the government doing to support manufacturing businesses in my electorate, and what obstacles is it facing?
Order. I give the call to the Minister for Industry and Science.
Thanks, Speaker. Thank you, Speaker. And I also want to ask me a question. I want to thank the member for Spence for that question. The member for Spence has the great place of Elizabeth in it that had a great heritage. A lot of auto workers employed in there that were very proud to make Australian-made cars. So I'm very grateful for that. And we know, like the Australian public knows, that manufacturing matters, creates great, secure, well-paid, full-time employment for Australians. And as much as it's an economic imperative for this country to manufacture more, as we learnt in the pandemic, it's also important from a geopolitical point of view because we've had so much of our production dependent on just one country, and the impact on supply chains huge. So we need, particularly in the key priority areas of the National Reconstruction Fund, to revitalise manufacturing, and this has been a big part of what we are trying to do across a range of areas to make sure that we change what we were left with by those opposite. We are the lowest producers of manufactured goods we consume in the OECD. So it's a big priority. So the NRF bill that we put has been here in the chamber since December. We've offered in-depth briefings to the coalition on that, yet the opposition, they can't help but other than to oppose. It's always about opposition. And every time on the big issues that involves Australian industry in this country, never there. They weren't there. We had a Liberal Defence Minister who said you wouldn't trust Australian shipbuilders to build a canoe. Liberal Minister. A Liberal Treasurer here who dared car makers to leave. Those opposite tried to stop the national broadband network and then had to crawl back to do the right thing. And they opposed the Button Plan as well. Superannuation, all the big calls, they've continually opposed, never been there. And when they had a chance to support manufacturers, with the energy relief bill that we put through, where manufacturers needed access to better priced gas, they voted against it. They voted against Australian manufacturing continually. And they have learnt nothing, they stand for nothing, they deliver nothing, they oppose everything. That is their standard. But I just want to make this point. You cannot be a party of the working class and pull the rug out from underneath the working class in the way your government did with manufacturing in this country. An absolutely shameful chapter.
Order. Before I call them in for Mayo, I'll give the call to the Deputy Leader Opposition on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I ask the Minister to table the paper that he's reading off, in particular so we can ascertain the quality and the Australian-made nature of the paper that he's reading off?
Was the Minister reading from... Order. Members on my right. The member for Hasluck. Was the Minister reading from confidential documents? I give the call... Order. Members on my left. Give the call to the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. The National Redress Scheme was designed to provide financial compensation to victims of child sex abuse as recommended by the Royal Commission. Applicants have been told it will take a further 18 months to process and they will not receive a gold card despite the Royal Commission recommendation. Will the Minister advise how the claim process can be improved to reduce the trauma of time and whether the provision of a gold card will be introduced into the scheme's compensation package?
The call to the Minister for Social Services.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Mayo for that question. Since becoming the Minister for Social Services, I've taken particular interest in the redress scheme, and I've had a number of important meetings where I've been able to discuss progress, firstly with my ministerial colleagues, state and territory colleagues, where we look to address the outstanding recommendations of the second-year review. The gold card was not one of those recommendations of the second-year review, but we are working through those issues, and hopefully we will be reporting early next year when it comes to finalising that important work. I also held a roundtable, or a significant forum with victim survivors, as well with those delivering the redress scheme. And we talked about some of the challenges around applications. Of course, dealing with applications in a timely manner is critically important. Although it was noted that in July last year the scheme had gone online, and there hadn't been appropriate resources allocated by the former government to deal with the influx of applications. In the October budget, I allocated an extra $15 million to deal with the application backlog. In saying that, I would like to note that the time it does take a participant to go through to redress is not always the processing time. Sometimes it can be at the participant's request. They would like to pause because it becomes emotionally incredibly distressing, and so at times it's directed by those being part of the scheme, wanting to pause that. Also gathering information from institutions. Sometimes those institutions are defunct and not able to provide it, and that does delay. But in terms of application delay, that is something I'm very mindful of. As I said, we've allocated extra resources in the most recent budget, and I look forward to continuing to work on how we best support people through that process, particularly making sure that those services that are funded to help them through in a trauma-informed way are done, and the application process within my department is also operating at its best.
Give a call to the member for Holt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How will the National Reconstruction Fund help to address some of the challenges, opportunities and risk facing the Australian economy?
Give a call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the member for Holt for her question and for the characteristically thoughtful contribution she made just before question time earlier today. Mr Speaker, we said we'd create a National Reconstruction Fund, and we are. I pay tribute to the former Shadow Minister, to the Minister, the Prime Minister, for making progress on this really important part of our economic plan. The need for the National Reconstruction Fund is really clear. When we came to office, there were obvious weaknesses in our supply chains. There were obvious consequences from a decade of energy policy chaos. And our industrial base wasn't wide enough or deep enough. And all of that meant that our economy wasn't resilient enough at a time of extreme global volatility. And this puts upward pressure on inflation. It's one of the reasons why inflation was already rising before the change of government, and why rates were also rising before the election as well. And it's why making our supply chains more resilient is such an important part of our efforts to address the inflation challenge. Now, the National Reconstruction Fund is all about grabbing the chances that come with a changing economy. It's all about creating more economic opportunities for more people in more parts of our country, including the regions, and especially when it comes to manufacturing. Now, it is a comical coincidence, Mr Speaker, that in the same week that those opposite claim to be the party of the working class, that they say that they will be voting against manufacturing jobs in this country. But while it's disappointing, Mr Speaker, it's not especially surprising. Those characters have formed. They've always seen manufacturing as something to chase away from our economy rather than something to support. They voted against taking some of the sting out of the gas prices, which were hollowing out manufacturers and risking sending them to the wall. They voted against the direct assistance for households and small businesses, and they wasted money in the budget at a time of rising inflation. So, Mr Speaker, over on this side of the House, we are interested in the solutions to our big economic challenges. Those opposite are part of the problem, and that's why they're showing that once again with their opposition to the National Reconstruction Fund. Mr Speaker, we have always been the party for working people, and we always will be. We have always been the party for manufacturing, and we always will be. And we are the only party in here with a plan to address the inflation challenge by making our economy more resilient and making our budget more responsible at the same time, by broadening and deepening our industrial base, by working with the private sector to grow the economy the right way and by backing the high-skill, high-wage jobs of the future.
Order. Give a call to the member. The Minister for Climate Change and Energy will cease interjecting. When people rise to their feet to ask the question, that is not the time to interject. Give the call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On Monday, the Prime Minister needed help from the Treasurer before he could tell the House that 800,000 households would be facing higher mortgage payments when they move from low fixed rates to higher variable rates this year. Prime Minister, how many small businesses will be moving to variable rate loans this year? Why do Australian families and small businesses always pay more under Labor?
Give a call to the Prime Minister.
I think the question is, why does the Shadow Treasurer exist if he's incapable of asking a question to the Treasurer?
Order.
Why is it? Why is that the case?
The Leader of the Nationals.
This is a bloke.
Order. Members on my left, I simply cannot hear the Prime Minister. If this continues, people will have... The member for Herbert is warned. When I'm speaking, that is not also the time to interrupt. The Prime Minister has the call and will be heard in silence, and if this continues, people will leave the chamber. It's that simple.
Thanks, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister has the call, and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition is warned as well.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The question is about interest rates from the Shadow Treasurer, who's incapable of asking a question of the Treasurer on a week in which yesterday we thought there'd be a question to the Treasurer and there wasn't. Today, when we were talking earlier today, I said to the Treasurer, I think today's the day, mate. I think today you are going to get a question from the Shadow. So you better be ready. And he said, I'm up for it. And he waited and nothing happened. But of course, the Shadow Treasurer did have something to say about interest rates when he was a part of the government. We're facing circumstances in what's happening here in the Ukraine and Russia that were not expected and very hard to predict. These pressures are driven by extenuating circumstances. But what we're doing through the good work of this Treasurer is making sure...
The member for Hume on a point of order.
Relevance, Mr Speaker. He doesn't know how many small businesses are facing higher...
Resume your seat. That is not a point of order. The Prime Minister is in order. The question was broad. The Minister for Climate Change and Energy is warned. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. The mob who came in here and voted against energy price relief for small businesses had the hide to stand up, and speak about the costs when it comes to small business. But of course, we know from the Leader of the Opposition who had this to say. I'm the Opposition Leader and the joy of being the Opposition Leader is that I'm not in government. That's what he had to say. I'm not paraphrasing, that's exactly what he had to say. Well, I'll tell you this, we were in opposition for some time and we had no joy in it. They have joy in it because whether they're in opposition or in opposition in exile sitting on the opposition bench, they're never for anything, only against it.
Order. The member for Bowman is warned. I repeat, when people are on their feet, that is not the time to interject. Give the call to the member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to accelerate the growth of Australia's critical minerals sector after a wasted decade?
Order. I give the call to the Minister for Resources and Minister for Northern Australia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. first and very seriously, I'd like to take this opportunity to extend my sincere condolences to the family of the worker who has tragically died following an incident at the BHP rail site in Port Hedland overnight. Every Australian worker should expect to come home safely from work, and any death at any Australian workplace is a tragedy, and I'm sure we all here today extend our condolences to the family, friends and fellow workers of that worker. I thank the member for Hunter for his excellent question. Mr Speaker, the demand for critical minerals is rapidly increasing, and this government is ensuring we're well placed to take advantage of this opportunity. Australia is the world's largest producer of lithium, the third largest producer of cobalt, the fourth largest producer of rare earth minerals and the fifth largest producer of nickel. Exports of metals used in low-emission technologies are expected to generate $33 billion in export earnings in 22-23, which is more than double what they earned the year before. The development of Australia's critical mineral resources is important not just to enable the global transition to net zero, but to ensure our partners can access secure supplies of these vital minerals into the future. Mr Speaker, development of our critical minerals will be supported by this government's $1 billion Value-Adding in Resources Fund, part of the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund, which will ensure a share of our raw minerals are processed here. But this is the fund that those opposite are now objecting to and not supporting. Perhaps it is no surprise that those who dared the car manufacturers to leave would now oppose the $1 billion Value-Adding in Resources Fund and its role in the National Reconstruction Fund. But this was not always the case, Mr Speaker. So let me reflect on what others opposite have said about developing Australia's critical minerals extraction and processing capacity and the need to add more value here in Australia. In relation to the critical minerals facility, which Labor supported, the Eneabba refinery project strongly aligns with the objectives of the government's critical mineral strategy. It captures more value onshore. That was said by Resources Minister, former Resources Minister Keith Pitt, the member for Hinkler. Resources Minister A, we shall call him, also was said at that facility, building a modern manufacturing sector and securing our sovereign capabilities is a key part of our plans for a stronger economy. That was said by the former Treasurer and member for Kooyong. Let's call him Treasurer A. Now, it was also said, we'll dig them up right here, we'll refine them right here, we'll look to make the products that use them right here. Well, that was said by the other Resources Minister and the other Treasurer, who is also the Prime Minister and the member for Cook, among many other things. So you have Resources Minister A, Treasurer A, having this exact same principle endorsed by Resources Minister B, Treasurer B and the Prime Minister. You used to support this principle and now you're running away from value-adding in resources.
Has concluded. Order. Members on my right. I give the call to the honourable member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The fuel tax credit scheme reduces costs on local businesses and keeps grocery bills lower for families. Will the Prime Minister rule out any change to the fuel tax credit scheme, or is this just another way Australian families will pay more under Labor?
Call to the Prime Minister.
Yes.
Give the call to the member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister.
Order. The House will come to order. I want to hear the member for Macquarie in silence. The Leader of the Opposition. Members on my left. I give the call to the member Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the government using federal funding in a fair and accountable way, particularly in light of revelations regarding the use of federal money for bushfire relief in New South Wales?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, and I thank the member for Macquarie for her question. And this week, those opposite announced they will vote no to our National Reconstruction Fund, a fund that will revitalise manufacturing and create secure jobs. I don't know why they want to bring Tony Abbott back in the Senate, because they can do exactly that philosophy of voting no to everything without him here. A fund that will provide an enormous boost to Australian agriculture, to Australian resources, to critical minerals, to renewable energy, as well as to our defence. The NRF will operate with integrity. It will have a board that is independent. That is independent. A bit like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation model that they tried to abolish time and time again. It will make decisions based upon what's best for our economy, not based upon what electorate an investment is in. They said no to this accountable economy-wide investment in the same week that we learned about the egregious rorting of bushfire relief funding by the New South Wales Liberals and Nationals. We've seen sports rorts, car park rorts, safer communities rorts and colour-coded spreadsheets from those opposite. But this is a whole different level. A whole different level.
The Leader of the Nationals.
This is the lowest of the low. The idea that the National Party in New South Wales, with the funds that were provided by the federal government as well as by the state government, sat down and changed the rules over who should get bushfire funding relief is just beyond contempt. Absolutely beyond contempt. And as Prime Minister, I have been to the member for Riverina's electorate, to the member for Page's electorate, to the member for Clare's electorate, to the member for Barker's electorate, to the member for Durac's electorate,
Order.
and made announcements, member for Braddon, member for Bass, where there are,
Order.
where there have been, where there have been,
Members on
where
my
there
right.
have been natural disasters, and we don't look at a map, we just provide support wherever it's needed. But the idea that on the one hand they are saying no to the National Reconstruction Fund that will provide support for our national economy, that will create jobs particularly in regional Australia, but not based upon a colour-coded map, based upon private sector activity that it will facilitate, but they're prepared to sit down and say nothing about the rorting of this bushfire fund relief. Not a peep from those opposite about this disgrace.
Expired. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition is on a warning. The call to the member for Dawson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Already regional Australians with a $500,000 mortgage are paying more than $12,000 a year as a result of recent rate hikes. Why do Australians always pay more under Labor?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question, but I don't thank him for voting against energy price relief. I don't thank him for not acknowledging the fact that pharmacies went down for people in his electorate from $42.50 to $30. I don't thank him for his carping and complaining about our childcare plans, which will provide childcare relief on July 1. I don't thank him for refusing to support our fee-free TAFE plan, which will provide 180,000 fee-free TAFE places.
The Prime Minister will pause and the members on my right will cease interjecting so I can hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, on relevance, a very tight question about mortgages and recent rate hikes, not give us a range of excuses, which is what the Prime Minister is doing right now.
Resume your seat. Prime Minister has had almost 1 minute of a preamble. The question was about mortgages and interest rates and costs. I'm asking him to be relevant to the question and ask him to return to the question.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And I was listening carefully to the tag there, and it said what was occurring under Labor, and I'm informing the member of what is happening under Labor. Cheaper medicine, cheaper childcare, expanding paid parental leave, getting wages moving, more affordable housing, energy price relief, fee-free TAFE.
Order.
Every one of those positive plans supported by those here, every one of those measures opposed by those opposite. Just like they're going to oppose the regional jobs created by our National Reconstruction Fund. Just like they're opposing manufacturing jobs in our region and the opportunity that businesses will have to renew by investing in newer equipment and transforming themselves, getting access to cleaner and cheaper energy, or new industries developing, such as the ones that my friend, the Minister for Resources, indicated in her answer earlier on today. I say to the member opposite that the Australian people sent a message on May 21st, and that message was this: they had conflict fatigue. They were sick of a government that just said what it was against and sought division. They wanted positive plans, and that's what we're delivering.
Give a call to the member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Treasurer. How's the Albanese Labor government responding to the inflation challenge, and what approaches has the government rejected?
Give a call to the Treasurer.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And today is a very appropriate day for us to acknowledge the really important work that the member for Newcastle does in our team and in this parliament. Mr Speaker, the inflation challenge is the defining feature of our economy in 2023, just as it was in 2022, and that makes it the government's major focus. In responding to the inflation challenge, the Independent Reserve Bank has its job to do. It does that job independently, and we don't interfere with their deliberations or second-guess their decisions. But our plan in the government to address this inflation challenge has three parts: responsible cost of living relief, which we provided in October and we will provide again in May; tackling the supply chain challenges that were left to us, and we've been talking about that today; and delivering a responsible budget with spending restraints so that we're not adding further fuel to inflation. That's why in the budget we returned 99% of the revenue upgrades to the bottom line over the next 2 years, when inflation is its most acute, and returning 92% over 4 years. That compares to an average of 40% under our predecessors. Now, our budget has payments falling in real terms over the next 2 years and real spending growth averaging just 0.3% a year over the forward estimates. That compares to real spending growth under our predecessors of 4.1% on average and 2.6% before the pandemic. Our first budget found $22 billion in savings. The impact of policy decisions was less than $10 billion, with 85% of this for unavoidable and legacy spending. And this compares to the $30 billion impact of key policy decisions by our predecessors, with no expenditure savings whatsoever in the March budget. So the restraint we showed in the budget was a key reason why the IMF and ratings agencies have been so positive about our efforts. The IMF said our spending restraint will help support monetary policy in holding back excess demand. Standard & Poor's said we expect the budget to improve because of steady revenue growth, high commodity prices and expenditure restraint. Fitch Ratings credited the budget with outlining a broadly neutral fiscal stance in the near term. And Morningstar said of the budget quite recently that most of the revenue windfall is being saved, and recently announced policy measures such as cost of living relief are being targeted and offset. Speaker, we know the best way to address inflation is through cost of living relief, dealing with supply chain pressures, including in the workforce, and managing the budget responsibly. That's why the spending restraint we've shown is so important and why it is completely unrecognisable to those opposite.
Give the call to the honourable member for Warringah.
Thank you. To the Prime Minister. The government can act on inflation and reduce emissions. In the US, the government passed the Inflation Reduction Act, where over 80% of the measures in that act went towards supporting household electrification and energy efficiencies, which will result in huge costs of living savings. Will you implement a similar program to accelerate household electrification and reduce cost of living for Australians?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for her question, and of course there are examples of where electrification can lead to a decrease in the costs of energy production, and where that is combined with renewables, particularly where you have renewables and battery storage. But I want to make this clear to the member for Warringah as well, which is this government won't be mandating what can be used in a household by individual Australians. I want to make that very clear. So if people want to fire up a barbie, or for restaurants, if they want to be using gas to produce their product, then that will be fine by us too. Fine by us too. What we want to do is to be able to facilitate choice, so that for many, if they receive support in terms of programs have been done in the past, whereby people can get either be it interest-free loans or some sort of support in order to transform their existing use of energy that can then be paid back, if you like, over a period of time, then that can make sense as well. So we understand that the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is a major breakthrough, and we also understand that around the world, all governments are acting. The difference between the Australian government of 2023 and the Australian government of 2021 and early 2022 is that we are joining with the world, looking at best practice, looking at ways in which we can be part of the global solution to climate change, because we know that increased use of renewables will reduce the cost of energy production, whether it be for households or for businesses, which is why it is tragic that we fell behind. Business was so far ahead of where the Australian government was, which is why businesses, including peak organisations like the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Industry Group, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and small business all backed our plan for a 43% reduction in emissions by 2030 was only opposed by those opposite.
The call to the member for Macnamara.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How is the Albanese Labor government working with Australia's biggest emitters to ensure they contribute a fair share towards our climate target while supporting economic growth? And what has been the response to these critical reforms?
Call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for his question and his leadership on matters of climate. And as the member for Macnamara knows, the Albanese government was elected with a mandate of developing a framework of policy consistency for emissions reduction in our biggest emitters, our 215 biggest emitters, by reforming the safeguard mechanism. And on the 9th of January, I went to Gladstone to announce the details of this policy, the government's preferred position, and we very much welcome the responses we've received from that. This is important, Mr Speaker. The emissions reduction achieved by this policy are equivalent to taking 2/3 of Australia's cars off the road. That's the size of the task. Now, an important part of this reform, Mr Speaker, is delivering below the baseline crediting. It's creating safeguard credits so that firms and facilities have incentive to reduce their emissions even more than they're required to under the law. It's a very important part of the reform, and it's the only part of the reform that actually needs legislation. The rest will be done by regulation. And I always want to be fair about these matters, Mr Speaker, as you know, and I want to give credit where it's due. This was a part of the policy we inherited from the previous government. The previous government announced, in response to the expert panel on low-cost abatement, that they would introduce below the baseline crediting, that they would introduce safeguard credits, Mr Speaker. That's what they said they would do. The former Minister for Energy announced that they would do it, Mr Speaker. Now, we know the Coalition opposes all of our policies, including the National Reconstruction Fund, but I have to report, Mr Speaker, that the Coalition has spiralled to such levels that they're now opposing their own policies, Mr Speaker. They're against their own policies.
The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Hume is on a warning. I assume wants to stay for the MPI. I call the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, the Minister has twice used an inaccurate and offensive description of this side of the House.
Resume your seat. The way question time will work, the Minister will refer to members or parties by their correct titles. The Manager of Opposition is correct.
To be fair to the member for Bradfield, we know that there was a debate between him and the Shadow Cabinet about this policy, and he didn't agree. But what we don't know is what the member for Hume contributed to that debate, because the member for Hume, when announcing the policy, which is exactly what the government's implementing, said this is just about making sure that Australian manufacturing has the right incentives in place to reduce emissions. This simply provides a carrot to enable them to reduce their emissions beyond that baseline. That's what the member for Hume said in 2020, in 2021.
Hume is on a warning.
He went on to say this provides an incentive for businesses to reduce their energy costs. Now, how did the member for Hume cope at Shadow Cabinet? Did he say, fantastic, great move, well done? Or did he say, terrible, bad move, not well done? What did he say? What did the member for Hume say at the Shadow Cabinet? He's against the policy he himself announced. Now, this tells us a number of things. We know the opposition's divided. We know they're dysfunctional. We know they had a worse climate policy now than they had under the member for Cook, which takes some doing, Mr Speaker. But it also tells us this is very important. They know this is good policy, but they're opposing it. They do not care about the national interest. If they don't care about the national interest in opposition, why would they ever care about it if they're ever in government?
The member for Moncrieff will leave the chamber. She has been continually interjecting. You may be sitting. The member for Moncrieff will come back to the dispatch box and apologise.
I withdraw. Mr Speaker, I apologise.
I thank the member for Moncrieff. Give the call to the Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister expelled CFMEU boss John Setka from the Labor Party after Mr Setka was convicted for harassing his wife, saying that, quotes, his values aren't the same as Labor's values. Yet following a period where the CFMEU has continued with its notorious violence, thuggery and intimidation towards women, Labor has accepted a $4.3 million donation from the CFMEU at this election. Prime Minister, what values does this Labor government share with the CFMEU?
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The Prime Minister will answer the question at the end.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I did take action to ensure that John Setka was expelled from the Labor Party. That's called leadership.
Give the call to the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Women. What action is the Albanese Labor government taking to help close the gender pay gap?
Give the call to the Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, today the government is taking significant step forward in advancing gender equality in Australian workplaces. We're fulfilling a key election commitment of this government to close the gender pay gap at work, including by boosting pay gap transparency and by taking action to help close gender pay gaps within organisations. We know that, on average, women working full-time can expect to earn 14.1% less than men per week. And you can imagine, over a lifetime, that is a significant deficit in terms of women's pay and their capacity to participate fully in the economic and social life of this country. And current projections suggest that it will take another 26 years for us to close that gap. Well, women cannot wait, they can't afford to wait, and they should not have to wait. With these reforms that are being introduced in the Senate, we will, for the very first time, publish the gender pay gaps of businesses that employ 100 or more people. And we know that experience around the world shows that this transparency does lead to organisations taking action to close their gender pay gaps. This reform will put Australia in the leadership group of OECD countries that collect and publish gender pay gap data. The legislation responds to the recommendations of the 2021 review of the Workplace Gender Equality Act 2012, and they are, of course, only just one aspect of the government's ambition for Australia to be a global leader in gender equality. This budget, the budget put gender equality front and centre, investing over $7 billion to actually drive gender equality. Through the Secure Jobs, Better Pay legislation, we took long overdue steps to promote gender equality, better pay and secure work for women. We're modernising paid parental leave and we're investing in cheaper childcare. We introduced paid domestic violence leave, which commenced on the 1st of February. And of course, we supported wage increases for the minimum wage and in aged care, which is predominated by women. And we've introduced legislation to implement all of the recommendations of the Respect at Work report. Under the previous government, we fell as low as 71st in the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Index 2022. This legislation being introduced by this government will deliver a better deal for women across Australia, and the government will continue to work hard every day to make Australia one of the most gender-equal countries in the world.
I give the call to the honourable member for Indi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Housing Minister. Housing is the most critical cry for help in my electorate. The previous government's National Housing Infrastructure Facility spent only 20% of its allocated funding, with none directed to regional and rural Australia. Under your housing fund, can you guarantee that funding for social and affordable housing will actually be directed to regional and rural Australia?
I give the call to the Minister for Housing and Small Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Indi for her question, but also for the great conversations and advocacy she's had for regional Australia, particularly in her electorate when it comes to affordable housing and making sure more of her constituents can have a safe, affordable place to call home. Because we do understand that we need more Australians to have a safe, affordable place to call home, because it's central to the security and dignity for all Australians. But of course what we had was a decade of very little action by the former Liberal National Government, and it's left us with significant challenges right across the country. Whether it be in Wangaratta in your electorate or in Burnie in my own electorate, people are struggling to find a home that suits both their needs and one that they can afford. I hear it all the time. Strong employment growth has not been matched with housing supply. We have businesses, local governments that have jobs to fill. However, attracting workers is frustrating because there is nowhere for them to live. It's actually a very serious issue. So tomorrow I will be introducing the legislation that the member asked about, which is the single largest investment in new affordable social and affordable homes in more than a decade, the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund. Indeed, returns from this fund will be there in perpetuity to invest in social and affordable housing right across the country. We anticipate there will be 30,000 social and affordable homes in the first 5 years of that fund. Importantly, for the member for Indi, Housing Australia, the new entity that will be created by the legislation that we introduce tomorrow, will ensure that this funding stream is equitably and fairly distributed across all states and territories, but also in inner city, outer suburban, regional and rural Australia. We need to make sure that the funding goes where it's most needed, but we also need to make sure that they're the right homes in the right places. The legislation that I introduce will also have the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council to be independent and provide independent advice to all tiers of government on options to increase housing supply right across the country. We want to make sure that that advice is independent, because we need to make sure that we have the right policies and the right levers are pulled by the right tiers of government to get more homes on the ground much more quickly. And the member raised the Housing Infrastructure Facility and the investments. We unlocked up to $575 million that was not being utilised, and just last week I was in Burnie to see an example of how the Commonwealth funding with the state funding and the community housing provider will provide 180 new homes just in northwest Tasmania. We of course have brought forward our regional first home buyer guarantee also, and we now have over 1,700 Australians that have their own home because we brought it forward. I want to assure the member we will be making sure that homes are in the right places right across the country and making sure that more Australians have a safe, affordable place to call home.
Concluded. The call to the honourable member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to help Australians with the cost of healthcare, and why has healthcare become so expensive?
The call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Lingiari for her question, but also for her wise advice about the delivery of healthcare services in her community in the Northern Territory. And she also knows that it's never been harder to see a GP in Australia than it is right now. It's never been more expensive. More Australians than ever before are having to pay a gap fee to see the doctor, and those gap fees have skyrocketed over the past decade. For the first time in the history of Medicare, the average gap fee for a standard GP consult is now more than the Medicare rebate itself, and gap fees to see a specialist skyrocketed by a whopping 100% over the past decade. Now, this massive increase to the cost of healthcare didn't just spring from thin air, Mr Speaker. This huge hit on household budgets was the inevitable consequence of the short but infamous tenure of the man voted by Australia's doctors as the worst health minister in the history of Medicare. The worst health minister in the history of Medicare, the now leader of the opposition. Because Australians will never forget, Mr Speaker, after promising there would be no cuts to health under him as health minister, his first budget tried to rip $50 billion from hospitals, tried to jack up the price of every medicine script by $5 and tried to slug every single Australian, every pensioner, every child, every concession card holder with a tax on every single visit to the doctor. And then, after we blocked his radical extremist agenda in the Senate, instead he imposed a 6-year-long Medicare rebate freeze, cutting billions and billions of dollars from general practice. Now, Mr Speaker, the contrast between that and our first budget could not be clearer. Our first budget delivering the biggest cut to the price of medicines in the 75-year history of the PBS, a $12.50 cut to the general scripts, not a $5 fee increase, which would have happened under the health minister then, the now leader of the opposition, if he got his way. In our budget, $200 million back into the pockets of hard-working Australians, good for household budgets and good for health. Good for the health of Australians, helping them ensure that they could afford the scripts that their doctors had prescribed as important for their health. Now, our cheaper medicines policy is already making a difference to millions of Australians, Mr Speaker. Lynn from Canberra wrote to us recently. She said, "My prescriptions have gone down since January 1st. This is such a welcome change for someone trying to manage a chronic illness and not eligible for a healthcare card." For this side of the House, Mr Speaker, it's all part of our commitment to strengthening Medicare and providing Australian households with responsible, targeted cost-of-living relief.
Give the call to the honourable member for McPherson.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, when was your office made aware that the Minister for Home Affairs had allowed the designation of Nauru as a regional processing country to lapse last October?
Call to the Minister for Home Affairs and Cyber Security.
Thank you so much, Speaker. Really appreciate that question.
The member for McEwen will leave the chamber. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, just a query of you. The question was asked of the Prime Minister when his office was made aware that the Minister had failed in her duty. And, Mr Speaker, the Minister can't answer that question on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Under practice, it is the Prime Minister can ask another minister to address a question, has long been the practice in this parliament, and particularly in previous parliaments that I have served in. And I give the call to the Minister for Home Affairs and Cyber Security.
Thank you, Speaker. I was informed of this on the 15th of December and the Prime Minister's office was informed immediately after that.
I give the call to the member for Macarthur.
My question is to the Minister for Government Services. What has the Royal Commission into Robodebt uncovered about the inaccuracy of the unlawful Robodebt system?
Give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and Minister for Government Services.
I thank the member for his question.
Members of the House may be interested to know that there's an important pattern of evidence emerging from the Royal Commission into Robodebt, in that the previous government and its various ministers were frequently, repeatedly and numerously warned over an extended period of years of problems with the Robodebt scheme. Yet the unlawful, illegal scheme continued.
The minister will resume his seat, and I will hear from the Manager of Opposition Business. On a point
Mr.
of order.
Speaker, I've raised with you on a number of occasions the danger that the conduct of the Minister for Government Services in repeatedly reporting on the proceedings of the Royal Commission is doing in terms of the overall status of the Royal Commission. I've referred particularly to Speaker Snedden's ruling that it raises the real threat of influencing the Commission. And I make this further point. Mr. Speaker, which is that the damage is greater with each successive time that this minister offends against the well-established protocols of this House.
I will hear from the order. The Assistant Treasurer will cease interjecting. I'd like to hear the Leader of the House in silence. The Leader of the House.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Just to the point of order, if I can provide an example slightly more recent than Billy Snedden. When the Royal Commission into Trade Union Governance was on, there were 56 questions that were asked. 56 that were asked in the floor of the chamber. The practice of being able to ask and answer questions of this nature has been very well established.
In relation, order. The member for Moreton is warned. When I'm about to give a ruling is definitely not the time to interject. In relation to the Royal Commission to Robodebt scheme, my approach has been to allow evidence to the Commission which has been publicly reported to be referred to in the House. But what I am less comfortable with is putting the construction on the evidence or the drawing of conclusions about the conduct of individuals who are parties to the proceedings. I therefore ask all members, including the Minister, to refrain from doing this when speaking about this Royal Commission in the House. And I call the Minister for Government Services.
Thanks, Speaker. I wish to specifically draw the attention of the House to some of the following evidence and exhibits in the Royal Commission, revealing the warnings that were not acted upon. Exhibit 3064, meeting with ACOS, 29th of November 2016. Exhibit 4649, letter from former Senator Nick Xenophon on 4th of December 2016. Exhibit 4641, media release from the member for Clark, dated 6th of December 2016. Exhibit 4648, constituent representations also raised by the member for Clark in December 2016. Exhibit 4648, data validation process that DHS briefed the member for Aston on December 2016. Exhibit 4652, Centrelink officer who blew the whistle to the media on the 23rd of December. Exhibit 4654, a letter from the National Council for Single Mothers and Their Children on the 30th of December. Exhibit 4732, further correspondence warning on the scheme. Exhibit 2532, an email from a Centrelink compliance officer to the Secretary of the former Minister's Department on the 7th of February 2017. There were protests from Robodebt victims directly to the member for Aston's office. In addition, a literature search reveals literally tens of thousands of articles in the media. It's been revealed in the Commission that the Minister investigated the personal files of 52 complainants, but not the actual complaints about the legality of the Robodebt scheme. There were 19,780 internal reviews by people within the system complaining about Robodebt. There were 4,339 external reviews to the AAT related to Robodebt. There was an ongoing campaign, which is recorded by the then opposition in the parliament and other parties in the media. There was Exhibit 4775, the missing $1 million Price Waterhouse Commission report. Even a PAL info search reveals 713 mentions of Robodebt and Hansard between the 7th of February 2017 and the 12th of November 2020. Australians listening to this question time will be justifiably perplexed and outraged as to why these warnings didn't fail to have the scheme stopped. Perhaps one answer is that on no less than 140 occasions, The 4 coalition ministers who've appeared on 140 occasions between them said, "I don't recall," or some variation of that. Wow. When the ministers don't recall what was happening, what chance did the robo-victims have?
Order. The member for Barker will cease interjecting and give the call to the member for Macpherson.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, if the Minister for Home Affairs office and your office was advised on the 15th of December last year that the designation of Nauru as a regional processing centre had lapsed in October, why wasn't the issue dealt with on that day, given that Parliament was sitting on the 15th of December?
Give the call. Order. There is order. When the House comes to order, there is far too much noise. The question has been asked, and I give the call to the Minister for Home Affairs and Cyber Security.
Thank you so much, Speaker. As the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs well knows, there's quite a process to redesignate Nauru as a regional processing country. We actually went through it all yesterday. You'd probably be aware of that. And quite a lot of documentation and consultation would have needed to occur, which did occur. I respect the questions of the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, but I'd also just point out that we did deal with this yesterday and Nauru has been redesignated. Thanks so much.
Order. Give the call to the member for Lyons.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. What challenges are facing Australia's education system as children go back to school, and what will the Albanese Labor government do to address them?
Give the call to the Minister for Education.
It certainly is. Thanks, Mr Speaker. Schools are back now right across the country, including in Tasmania. There's a lot of happy students and a lot of relieved parents. I'm asked about challenges by the member for Lyons. There's plenty of them. The worst of COVID is hopefully now behind us, but we're still seeing the lingering after effects of it in our schools. Ask any teacher and they'll tell you about the mental health impacts that are still affecting some students. And that's why this year we're rolling out funding to each and every school right across the country to fund things like extra counsellors, but also practical things like school camps and excursions. And you can also see the impact of COVID on school attendance rates, which dropped again last year. But it's not just COVID. Over the last 10 years, we've seen drop in attendance rates right across the board, amongst boys and girls, primary schools and high schools, government and non-government schools, and in the bush and in the cities. And this is serious, because if you're not at school, you're not learning. And that's why I've put this on the agenda to discuss with education ministers when we meet later this month. We've also got the challenge of a teacher shortage crisis. Go to any school and you'll see it. In the last 10 years, we've seen a drop in the number of people becoming school teachers of about 16%. Not enough young people becoming teachers and too many people leaving the profession they love, and it has an impact on our schools. In December, just before Christmas, education ministers met to sign off on a plan to tackle this, and the challenge this year is for us to roll out that plan. But the biggest challenge of all is this. If you're a child from a poor family, if you're a child from regional Australia, if you're an Indigenous child, you're 3 times more likely to fall behind at school. That's the verdict of a Productivity Commission report that came out only a couple of weeks ago. 10 years ago, the gap in reading skills of an 8-year-old from a poor family and an 8-year-old from a wealthy family was 1 year. It's now more than 2. And that gap grows with every year at school. So by the time you're in Year 9, the gap is 5 years. That's the awful truth. In the last 10 years, we've seen attendance rates get worse, the teacher shortage get worse, and this gap get worse as well. That Productivity Commission report is blistering in its criticism of the Coalition Education Agreement. It says that it lacks targets and lacks real practical reforms to get there. The next one will. In the next few weeks, I'll announce an independent panel to advise on what those targets should be and the reforms to get there, tied to funding, to help us build a better education system and a fairer education system for all Australians.
The Leader of the Opposition, call the Prime Minister.
Thanks. Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.